I think about killing myself a lot. And I have for a very long time. It's in large part due to my disorder and the trauma that drives it. So despite the fact that thinking about killing myself is fairly normal to me, I know that it isn't normal for other people. I wish I could say something like, "Don't worry about it," with confidence. They were just overreacting, but I don't honestly know if I can say that. Most of the time, suicide is never far from my mind, after all. I've made multiple attempts to kill myself. That's why I feel uneasy saying, "Don't worry about it," to people when trying to assure them that I'll be fine. I'd used a hot bath and slit wrist before. I've even took care to cut along the vein. I bled a lot for a while, but I didn't even feel lightheaded. That was the first time. I sat in the bath for a few hours, surfing the internet with my perfectly balanced computer before I made my second attempt. I got frustrated. I dropped my computer into the red water, plugged into the wall and everything. The breaker switched, the house went dark, and I was perfectly fine. I dropped the toaster in the bath. That should kill you. If dropping a toaster in the bath should kill you, why not a high-end laptop while it was charging? If nothing else, the plug ran directly into the water, so it should work like that, right? It actually is possible that I misunderstood something when I tried. See, but not the third. You'd think mangling your arm with a knife would be enough. I jammed a French knife through my flesh 6 or 7 times, aiming for one artery that I actually knew about. I remember blood pooling at my feet, pain searing in my bones from severed nerves, and desperately trying to pick up signals from the rest, realizing that they'd been, for lack of a better phrase, cut off. Couldn't move my fingers very well or feel them very much. I also couldn't hide this attempt from my roommates. I was taken to a hospital, and somehow, with my arm in meaty tatters and wrapped in bloody bandages, I managed to talk my way out of a 72-hour hold. It wasn't that I didn't think I needed the hold. I certainly agreed that at the time, I did. But I had also promised to cover a coworker's shift that weekend. I suppose now is as good a time as any to mention that I work as a DSP for developmentally disabled adults during this time period. As trivial a concern as it may come as, I didn't simply let my coworker or clients down. The trigger for these suicidal episodes was pretty clear-cut. Stress. The particular disorder I have has extremely high suicidal rates compared to the rest of the population, and the rates for attempted suicides are in the neighborhood of 70% of people holding the diagnosis. Stress affects your mind, and it could be acted on by any other disorder that can inspire stress. Adrenaline issues, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. More than that as well. For brief moments that are difficult for us to notice. As we get worked up, our perception of events can change just so much to create a massive episode. Self-harm, destructive acts, and of course, suicide. It's a little scary to know that if I have a particularly bad day, my brain might decide to start a chemical reaction that prompts me to actively work against my own prosperity and survival. I've gotten better at resisting it, but I'll never be cured of whatever this is. I think my most recent suicide attempt was what drove this home for me. After failing to bleed to death twice and avoiding electrocution once, I tried a more painless method. I swallowed a few bottles of sleeping pills. Bottles. I was trying to be absolutely sure that I'd overdose while asleep. I remember that I laid down sometime afterward and drank a little bit of water. My thumbs twiddled. I rolled over and stared at my wall. Tears welled up in my eyes, and a smile laid across my face. It would end. All of it would end. And I would be so happy. I thought about all the times that I'd heard people discuss suicide as a selfish act, as though they disregarded the things that underlined it. God forbid my chronic condition be visible. God forbid I ask for mercy. Once I started fixating on suicide, I simply couldn't stop. It was a permanent solution to a permanent problem. One where brain chemistry would have to always be tempered by by will and effort, and my only acknowledgement for feigning wellness was a pat on the back. Yet, if I showed the symptoms of being sick, I'd have my entire life taken from me. I elected that I would be the one to take my life instead. I decided that I wouldn't drain anybody else's resources any longer. I wouldn't be a burden to myself. They'd be free, I'd be free. These justifications drove my resolve as the darkness crept through my vision and overcame my sight, and then there was nothing. There was stillness. Everything was black. And then there was something. Something I didn't comprehend. Then I was awake. In my bed. Pill bottles empty next to me and not dead. I started to cry, big sobbing tears. There was nothing quite like going to sleep, secure in the knowledge that you won't be waking up, and then, against all odds, you wake up. The outside world still continues on, and that part's fine because you know that it would, but you're still there. I was still there. I worked that night. I had plans that day. The weight of still being rolled down my shoulders and crushed my back. I struggled out of bed, groggy but not otherwise harmed. As days would pass, it would prove that I had no brain damage or other obvious side effects. The keyword is obvious. It was a few weeks later when I had my first in a series of very vivid dreams. I dreamt I was floating in the sky above a desert, but beneath the clouds. I wasn't frozen in place. I could move just fine, aside from the fact that my position was fixed to this single point in space. I heard a loud noise from above me, like tons of metal scraped and screeched together. I turned towards the source of the sound, rotating to face the clouds. At first, I saw nothing. And then suddenly, the clouds opened up. I saw the tip of something golden breach the sky, and as it emerged further, the sun sank behind it. The sheer size of what was falling was overwhelming for even the sky to completely behold. Its tip surged towards me, and I winced as it collided. My eyes opened wide as I screamed and coughed into the darkness of my room. Something wet, thick, tasting like iron bubbled out of my mouth. I didn't need to turn on the light to confirm it was blood, but it wasn't as though I was in any condition, too. My chest had a literal hole in it. I confirmed it with my hand, grasping at my heart. Blood trickled out of my lips, down my chin, and as the shock settled in, my legs grew weak, and I stumbled over into the wall. I'm certain that it was this combined with the blood loss that knocked me unconscious. I woke only a few moments later. The darkness well settled while the smell of blood was still settling. I felt the pain and grasped at my chest again, finding only that sticky wetness coating my torn shirt and my body completely intact. I stood up in a daze, not of blood loss, but of confusion, and stumbled my way to the light switch. There was no way what just happened transpired, and the light would reveal the truth of the situation, but it did happen. The bloodstains from my sheets to the floor were the proof. I threw open the door and ran into the bathroom, panic rising as my head started to feel hazy from fear. I was covered in blood. Some crimson speckles dotted the upper bit of my face, but bloodstains cascaded down my chin to my neck, and then just below that bit where the blood faded into the fabric of the neck of my t-shirt was more blood, darker stains all the way around my neck and the top of my pants, still slick with my own gore. In the darkness of my house, I made feeble attempts to stifle my own screams, squawking and squeaking quietly as snot and tears choked out of my face. I fled back to my room, the smell of iron or perhaps even copper hanging in the air. It was blood, my blood. I was smelling my own blood as it polluted the room. I shriveled in the corner until morning. The dawn peeked through the blinds inquisitively, only for me to shut it out frantically. I can't rightly recall how long I spent cowering as my own fluids congealed and decayed around me. But I don't imagine it was for very long for my roommates to discover me. The few people I talked to probably grew concerned quickly. I made it the business of my closest friends to know my suicide history, and if I ever get silent to check up on me. I'm almost confident they checked on me before the end of the night, but what they found was a scene from a horror movie. I struggled to recall much of what happened next. I was hospitalized fully and completely. I remember pills and tests and questions. I don't completely remember being released. I just remember that one day, sort of snapping back to myself at work, knowing what I needed to do and remembering relevant parts of the day previous. Details were scarce. The blood in the room was confirmed mine, but they found no possible explanation of what had happened. My roommates were still in the house, but it wasn't for long. They explained to me that after the incident, they had discussed the issue with the landlord, and she was allowing them to move out without incurring penalty. I, however, was meant to stay behind. I was somewhat glad they were gone. I felt awful for whatever it was that happened, as though it had been my fault in some way. I knew that probably wasn't true, but they experienced something genuinely horrible. And I was still the center of it, unwitting or not. But even that said, the reason I was glad that they were gone was because I had been through something horrible too. But where they had each other, they set me aside and laid the blame on me. I'd rather have been alone in that hostile environment. Before they left, they were sure to tell me that I was on some weird demonic shit. Shortly afterward, news of what had happened reached my boss. Now, they weren't particularly thrilled that somebody who was suicidal and potentially violent were around their vulnerable clients. I understood why they made their decision to begin a slow process of letting me go, but while I didn't begrudge them for it, my resolve to kill myself only intensified. I just cut the shit and I quit. I didn't know what happened to me, but it wouldn't happen again. I bought a handgun. Not the most powerful kind because I'm not made of money, but one that would do the job if I shot myself in the right place. I was through with the games. There'd be no failure this time. I would succeed. Everything would be all right. But it wasn't all right. That night, after I had loaded the gun with a bullet and reaffirmed my conviction, I pulled the trigger. I was greeted to the sound of nothing but the hammer clicking. Only to see that the bullet didn't fire. A dud, I presumed. I smiled wryly, chambered another round as I braced for the second trigger pull. Again the hammer clicked, but there was no result. I tried one more time, to the inglorious sound of the hammer striking once again to no effect. My hands shook as I placed the gun down and I stared at the box of bullets. I ran my hands over my head, fingers tangling in my hair before I forced my resolve to anew. I reloaded the gun, a full clip this time, and flicked the safety on as I shoved it into my pocket. I left my house that night, the small box of ammo in the other side of my pants, and headed into the woods that surrounded the house I resided in. Deeper into the trees I went, deeper still until I couldn't hear any cars from the road nor see any light from my home. I found a downed tree and sat upon it. I placed the gun to my temple, first before pausing. What if, just like all the other times, this didn't work? No, it had to. I was lucky that the first 3 bullets were duds. It gave me time to realize that there would be less cleanup this way. I pulled the trigger knowing that the gun would go off. For the 4th time, it did not. I grunted and shouted incoherent gibberish before aiming the barrel at the ground and pulling the trigger. Bullet fired. I fired 5 more times in rage, leaving myself with a single bullet in the chamber. I turned the gun on myself, pushed the muzzle against my scalp, the heat of the metal burning my flesh. This time, it would work. I had to be through all of the duds. I had to be. I pulled the trigger. And there was nothing once more. I dropped the gun, dropped the bullets from my pocket, and chucked them in their goddamn box somewhere in the forest. I stormed back to my house that night, quietly crept up to my room, and I closed the door behind me. The room was darker than I realized. I was seldom up here these hours, so I had no reason to know so thoroughly the darkness dwelling beside me. I sat down on my bed, reclining back into a position where I laid down. It was then that I noticed a smell that was very out of the ordinary. It wasn't the blood. With my roommate gone, I had sought a new room now that I could pick. My old room lay messed with bloodstains still, and I discarded it at the first opportunity. Still, this is a very different scent. One other than blood. It was one of animals, of body odor, of stale breathing and still bodies. I went to sit up and I felt a hand appear on my chest. It was a gentle touch. Yet I was frightened. Whose hand was it? I felt it press against my chest with a careful urgency, and I obeyed it, laying back into the ground. I heard something emanating from the darkness beyond. It sounded like the growl of a prowling predator. I felt the hand retreat from my chest, and moments later I felt the hot, rancid breath of something upon my face as claws clicked on the ground beside me. It became dreadfully clear that I was no longer in my bed. I heard the beast growl before it trotted off, its footfalls trailing until they stopped. It shifted in the direction as it settled into place. My arms began to feel around. I felt warm torsos, legs, other hands, people, all clearly alive, all lying motionless in the dark. I turned my head back to one that had touched me. I whispered in the most quiet voice I could, "Where am I?" In response, the thing in the darkness bounded towards us, and I felt its teeth clamp upon my arm. I started to scream as its foot pressed into my chest, its claws sticking into my meat and my bones cracking. I awoke again, covered in blood. Injured, woozy, and shrieking, I rolled off my bed with one of my arms dangling by strands of meat and the other clutching at my torn chest. I flopped on the floor as I felt my body seize in darkness, sweep over my spirit like a vacuum, sucking it away into nothing. Then with the dawn I awoke once more, covered in blood, completely healed, with another room ruined as well as more clothing. That was to say nothing of my mental state. I was at a sincere, honest loss. What would I do to explain this? Where would I turn to? Was I actually going crazy? I had to be. These occurrences. The blood, my vanishing wounds, and my tattered clothes, I knew enough to be certain that I had no idea what to do. I had an urge to attempt suicide again immediately, but finally, apathy and resignation had made significant progress in their steady creep to overtake my existential despair. Suicide was an option, but not a viable one. Not while fate continued to taunt me, not while bullets didn't fire, not when overdoses didn't deliver on their promises. I meandered about my house for a few days, only leaving to out applications in jobs that I couldn't personally justify having. It felt insincere to have been wishing for death amongst these people. I felt it in their expressions and how they conveyed their perceptions and read experiences. There was an emptiness in my heart, and it led to my superficial sincerity. I felt them inhabiting some middling existence they had managed to find happiness with, maybe not consistently, maybe not a whole big lot of it, but their days weren't filled with any other undercurrent of self-loathing so powerful that it could drag a ship down into inescapable depths. I watched people move around me day in, day out for another week. Myself merely a hole shaped like a person hiding out amongst real people. I picked up a new job fairly quickly as a cart pusher at a local supermarket. It wasn't ideal, but it would work. I would endure it until I might find something better. Not that I had the particular motivation to look. It was the end of the week where things changed for me yet again. I was a fixture in the parking lot, a constant that was expected, but whose specific absence would not have been noticed by customers. Sometimes I wasn't noticed by people in cars either. I'd have plenty of near misses before, but never had somebody so inattentive as to actually collide with me. It was all so quick. A crack, that I felt myself in the air. My legs hurt as they were thrown upwards, but the sensation was dulled. I was disoriented. I didn't know what direction I was facing, and then it was dark. It was like the great darkness you see when you're trying to remember what it feels like to be asleep. Only I didn't have to recall it. I was in that absent space inhabiting the mind. That incomprehensible feeling I had by this point dismissed and forgotten from when I tried pills returned. I felt something whose properties I had no words for touch me. I burned, I froze, I hurt. Then that hurt spread across me like a fire and I started to scream. I felt for a brief moment that I was falling and then I hit the cold ground beneath me. I was not in the parking lot when my eyes fluttered open. I was somewhere entirely different, a city, to be sure, but not like any kind I had ever seen. For starters, it seemed to be made mostly of gold, with gems and other precious metals comprising the most minute details. I couldn't place the architecture. That's not to imply that I'm an expert on what other cultures made things look like, but it wasn't something obvious to me. These buildings were triangular and jutted out of the ground at varying angles. They looked like crooked tombstones. With the way that they loomed above me in the sky, I could see the sun, but not a single cloud in any direction. The sky itself was a slightly darker shade of blue, farther from the horizon than it was. It seemed like I could faintly see the stars. I shivered. I put my hands around my body. The air was cold. I could hear people. I'm not sure when the others around me actually got there. I hadn't noticed them before, and I couldn't have missed something or so overt, right? They didn't seem to notice me either, bumping into me without apparently having any reaction. That's when, from immediately behind me, I heard a loud scream. It was ghastly, as though somebody had been gutted. I spun on my heels, and the world went dark. But I did not pass out. I was still standing, stumbling, dizzy with confusion, until I realized that I had somehow moved a mere moment later. The screaming was louder in this place. I could hear wet noises and low growls that sounded unfortunate amounts of familiar. I smelled body odor, gore in the air. I felt the air enter my lungs in shallow breaths. Unmanicured claws clicked quietly against the stone floor, then something brushed against my arm, something warm and wet. Instinctively, I pulled back, and a silent gasp escaped my lips, though it was not my faint cry which gave me away. I heard the beast roar mere inches from me, and I turned to run, only to exit the darkness into a street. I did not intentionally stop running. It was only after a few seconds that I realized the danger had passed, and I plopped down on my rump. What the fuck was happening to me? I hugged my knees to my chest and felt with one arm the fresh blood that had been wiped under the other. I was standing again, and in tears from shock and horror, I turned around and I saw a door before me. A big metal door to a small building. It had no windows, and inside of it I could hear the screaming that I had been hearing. They were markings scrawled upon the building, a language that I couldn't read, but I watched those symbols bend and twist themselves into new forms, into English. I could read words now. This building was simply called Chamber of Lions. Apt if my experience was true, I put it together, a dark room full of people with hungry lions. It sounded like a Bible story that I'd heard when I was really young. David and the lions, only David doesn't get devoured like the poor bastards inside. Was it a sacrifice of some kind? I heard the rattling of chains, and I turned around again. My eyes fell upon a contingent of 3 guards, with a little boy bound in rags and chains. His hair was long and unkempt. Hanging over his eyes, I couldn't see his face, but I could read his scars like a map of tragedy. Cuts, gashes, stab wounds, and more were all clearly visible on his arms and legs. His torso was bruised, and overall he looked harshly battered. The guards each held a section of chain like a leash, with strips of cloth tied around the outsides of where the chains crossed to better keep them in place. They were all silent as they ushered him to the room. They didn't even unbind him to put him inside, pulled the door open, shoved him in quickly, and shut the door. They seemed woefully disorganized in the process, almost like they'd never done it that way before. The screaming inside died down. The building fell silent once more as the guards walked away from it, but I listened. I moved closer to the edge of the building, and very faintly, I could hear what sounded like metal scraping against stone. My vision was interrupted when my eyes opened yet again. And I awoke in a hospital bed. Yet even as the fluorescent lights violated my eyes, the gentle sound of chains behind the stone walls took time to dismiss itself. I was disoriented and groggy, though I find myself still unsure of whether it was from the dream or the drugs. I was hooked up to a machine and an IV drip when I woke up. I felt no pain from the accident that I clearly remembered. My legs were in a cast, but they didn't hurt and I could move them. There were bandages around my head that covered one of my eyes, which was no doubt from a concussion. Bandages covered my skin in patches and bundles, and I quickly figured that my torso was at least in a cast. I wasn't certain how long I had been there or how long I'd been unconscious, but I was alarmed to note that the substance in the drip was morphine. The bag looked half empty, but I was unimpeded mentally, sober to be direct. The hospital buzzed with a sound beyond my door. I could hear intermittent voices and footsteps outside the room, and my fingers slid up to the call button on the television remote at my bedside. When I waited for someone to come, it was probably 20 minutes later that a nurse arrived, after I had already turned on the TV as a personal distraction. She was confused to the point of shock. She probably had assumed a visitor hit the button, that a visitor was watching TV. She must never have thought the patient with a broken body would have been awake and alert. Only there was dissonance. The doctor came and explained to me what had just transpired. The car accident where I was hit broke my legs from the force and due to the speed that the vehicle was traveling through the parking lot. Possessed, it sent me some distance over and behind the car. There, my head cracked against the pavement. If the impact wouldn't have killed me, then the other car that failed to use its brakes in time must have, for it ran across my spine and torso to crush my body. When the paramedics arrived on the scene, they didn't think I would make it. As a matter of fact, they nearly called for a mortician, but despite all the damage, I had maintained a weak pulse. Even if I had survived, they said that the cranial trauma would leave me in a vegetative state, and now, scant hours later, I wasn't just conscious, I was completely healed. My case was not made private. Locally, after my release, I was something of a big deal. People called my recovery nothing short of a miracle. They found my recovery incredulous. The doctor presiding over me was both frustrated by this and unsurprised. His reasons were a shock. As it turns out, I was not the first case of this, whatever it was. While it was relatively new and exceedingly rare, he revealed to me that in the previous year alone, there had been 47 reported cases where people not only survived from terrible accidents, but made miraculous recoveries. I was flabbergasted. Now at my home, I sat with the information that he had given me. One of the first people affected with this condition was asking to hear from others with it. The man was himself a doctor, and he was researching what had been happening. I was nervous as I held the paper in my hands. My phone sat on my coffee table, still and silent, and the red sun crept over the horizon. A few shadows that it cast into my home as the light faded were long and jagged. A number was illuminated with pink light from the window, the same pink light that invaded my house through my long windows. My living room felt dead. I was a living legend locally, but my roommates, my friends, refused to even speak to me when I called them after. I had needed a ride home, but to be so flatly rejected. My heart stung. I was isolated. I could never know when my next torturous dream would come. I apparently had become unable to die. And worst of all, I was still suicidal.